The airport was alive with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Passengers hurried through the terminal, some pulling luggage, others clutching coffee cups, all with the urgency of people who had places to be. The intercom buzzed with flight announcements, and the hum of conversations blended into an indistinguishable background noise. Amidst this, Sarah Thompson stood near Gate 32, tapping her foot impatiently as she glanced at her watch for the third time in as many minutes. Sarah was a picture of success. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her tailored business suit immaculate. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without saying a word. At 32, she had built a promising career in corporate law, earning a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and, as some would say, a bit cold. But Sarah didn't mind. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to win. As she stood there, scanning her surroundings with a practiced eye, her gaze fell on a man sitting a few seats away. He was tall, with broad shoulders and skin the color of mahogany. His presence was quiet, almost serene, as he read a book, seemingly oblivious to the hustle and bustle around him. There was something about him that unsettled Sarah, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She looked away, trying to ignore the slight discomfort that had crept into her chest. It was silly, she told herself, to feel uneasy about a stranger. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Finally, the boarding announcement for her flight came over the speakers. Sarah grabbed her bag and joined the line, doing her best to maintain her composure. She handed her ticket to the gate agent with a tight smile and walked down the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal floor. When she reached her seat, 12B, a window seat in the middle of the plane, Sarah stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, exhaling a small sigh of relief. Flying wasn't her favorite thing, but she had done it enough times to know how to manage her anxiety. A book, some music, and she'd be fine. Just as she was settling in, she saw him again, the man from the gate. He was making his way down the aisle, his movements unhurried, his expression calm. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when he stopped at her row. "Excuse me," he said in a deep, polite voice, gesturing to the seat beside her. "I believe that's my seat." For a moment, Sarah froze. She felt a wave of irritation wash over her, mingled with something else, something darker. She quickly pushed it aside, giving him a curt nod as she stood to let him pass. As he sat down in 12C, she caught a faint whiff of his cologne, clean and understated. Trying to suppress the growing discomfort, Sarah fumbled with her seatbelt. She glanced at the man out of the corner of her eye. He had already returned to his book, seemingly unaware of her presence. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, nothing that should make her feel this way. And yet she did. Sarah's mind raced. This flight was nearly 5 hours long, and she wasn't sure she could endure sitting next to him for that entire time. Her thoughts spiraled, conjuring up images of awkward conversations, or worse, an unbearable silence. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to do something. Without thinking too much, she pressed the call button above her head. A flight attendant appeared moments later, smiling warmly. "How can I help you?" the attendant asked. "I was wondering if there are any other seats available," Sarah said, keeping her voice low, hoping the man next to her wouldn't hear. "I'd prefer to sit elsewhere." The attendant's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Let me check for you." As the attendant walked away, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and guilt. She knew her request was irrational, maybe even inappropriate, but the discomfort she felt was real, and she couldn't just ignore it. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked. There aren't any other seats available." Sarah's heart sank. She forced a smile and thanked the attendant, who nodded sympathetically before walking away. She was trapped. There was no escape from this situation, and the thought of spending the next several hours in such close proximity to this man filled her with an unease she couldn't shake. The man beside her shifted slightly, getting comfortable in his seat, and Sarah tensed. She could feel the anxiety bubbling up inside her, threatening to spill over. What was wrong with her? Why was she reacting this way? The plane's engines roared to life, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Sarah tried to focus on their words, but her mind kept drifting back to the man beside her. Every little movement he made seemed amplified in her mind. The rustle of his jacket, the turn of a page in his book, the occasional deep breath. As the plane taxied down the runway, Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She needed to get a grip. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, a professional, someone who prided herself on being rational and composed. And yet, here she was, on the verge of a panic attack simply because of the person sitting next to her. The plane lifted off the ground, and Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. She hated takeoff. It was the part of flying that always made her stomach churn. She could feel the plane climbing, the ground falling away beneath them, and her anxiety spiked even higher. Next to her, the man remained calm, his demeanor unchanged. Sarah glanced at him again, wondering how he could be so composed. What was his secret? How could he sit there, completely at ease, while she was a bundle of nerves? She didn't have much time to dwell on it, though, as the plane soon leveled out, and the seatbelt sign was turned off. The flight attendants began their routine, moving down the aisle with drink carts and snack trays. Sarah finally released her grip on the armrests and tried to relax. She reached for her bag and pulled out a book, hoping it would distract her from the discomfort gnawing at her insides. But as she opened the book and started to read, she found it impossible to focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the man beside her, to the way he made her feel, like she was trapped in a situation she couldn't control. And that, Sarah realized, was what scared her the most. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Sarah struggled to maintain her composure. The book in her lap lay open, but her eyes weren't on the pages. Instead, she was staring straight ahead, her mind a whirl of uneasy thoughts. She could feel the presence of the man beside her, as if the space between them was charged with a palpable tension. It was irrational, and she knew it. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling. Michael, the man sitting next to her, seemed utterly relaxed. He had finished his book and was now scrolling through his phone, a small smile playing on his lips as he looked at something on the screen. His demeanor was the epitome of calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil Sarah felt inside. She stole another glance at him, trying to understand what it was about him that made her so uncomfortable. Was it just his presence? Or was it something deeper, something within herself that she wasn't ready to confront? The flight attendant passed by again, offering drinks. Sarah requested a glass of white wine, hoping it would take the edge off her nerves. Michael declined, still engrossed in whatever he was reading on his phone. When the flight attendant handed Sarah her drink, she took it with a shaky hand, trying not to spill it as she brought it to her lips. The wine was cool and crisp, a temporary balm for her frayed nerves. She took a deep breath, trying to force herself to relax. It was just a flight, she told herself. A few hours and it would be over. She would land, get off the plane, and this whole experience would be nothing more than a memory. But the unease wouldn't go away. The more she tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. It gnawed at her, feeding on her fear and uncertainty, growing stronger with every passing minute. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the world around her, but all she could see was the image of Michael, sitting beside her, calm and composed. The contrast between them was stark, and it only made her feel more out of control. She wasn't used to feeling like this, vulnerable, anxious, afraid. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as the plane flew through the clear skies. Sarah could hear the low murmur of other passengers talking, the soft hum of the engines, the clinking of glasses as the flight attendants moved through the cabin. It was all so normal, so routine, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her thoughts wandered back to the man beside her. What was his story? Where was he headed? Why did he seem so at ease, while she was falling apart inside? She had so many questions, but none of them seemed appropriate to ask. Besides, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answers. The flight dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Sarah's discomfort had settled into a low, steady thrum, a background noise to her increasingly frantic thoughts. She kept sipping her wine, hoping the alcohol would dull her senses enough to make the rest of the flight bearable. But it only seemed to make her more aware of how trapped she felt. At some point, she drifted off into a fitful sleep, the wine finally taking its toll. Her dreams were disjointed and unsettling, filled with flashes of dark skies, turbulence, and a sense of impending doom. She tossed and turned in her seat, her subconscious mind unable to escape the anxiety that had taken hold of her. When she awoke, it took a moment for her to remember where she was. The cabin was dim, the lights turned low as most of the passengers tried to get some rest. She blinked, disoriented, and then the reality of her situation came rushing back. She was still on the plane, still sitting next to the man who had, for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, caused her so much unease. Michael was asleep, his head resting against the window. His face was peaceful, his breathing slow and even. Sarah watched him for a moment, envy stirring in her chest. How could he be so relaxed, so completely at ease, when she felt like she was on the verge of a breakdown? She turned away, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her once more. The cabin was quiet, the only sounds the soft rustling of blankets and the occasional cough or sniffle from other passengers. Outside, the sky was pitch black, the plane cutting through the night like a ghost. Sarah felt utterly alone, trapped in a situation she couldn't control. She wanted to get up, to move, to do something, anything to break the suffocating tension that had wrapped itself around her. But there was nowhere to go, nothing she could do. She was stuck here, with nothing but her thoughts and fears to keep her company. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging slower than the last. Sarah could feel herself spiraling, her thoughts racing in a chaotic loop. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm herself, but it was no use. The anxiety had taken hold, and it wasn't letting go. Suddenly the plane jolted, a brief but sharp dip that sent her heart racing. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, as her breath caught in her throat. The turbulence wasn't severe, but it was enough to push her already frayed nerves to the breaking point. She glanced over at Michael, who was still asleep, completely unfazed by the turbulence. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and frustration. How could he be so calm when everything felt like it was falling apart? The turbulence passed quickly, but Sarah's anxiety didn't. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of a breakdown, every nerve in her body stretched to its limit. She closed her eyes, trying to will herself into calm, but all she could think about was how badly she wanted this flight to be over. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of anxiety and restless dozing. Sarah barely noticed when the captain announced their descent. Her mind too preoccupied with the growing sense of dread that had taken root in her chest. It wasn't just the fear of flying anymore. It was something deeper, something she didn't want to confront. As the plane began its descent, Sarah gripped the armrests again, bracing herself for the landing. She could feel the change in altitude, the way the plane dipped and swayed as it descended through the clouds. Her stomach churned, and she swallowed hard, trying to keep the panic at bay. When the plane finally touched down, she felt a brief, fleeting sense of relief. But it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that, despite everything, she was still trapped. Trapped by her own thoughts, her own fears, her own prejudices. The plane taxied to the gate, and the passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Sarah stayed in her seat, waiting for the aisle to clear before she made a move. She wasn't ready to face the world just yet. Michael woke up as the plane came to a stop. He stretched, yawning, and then turned to Sarah with a polite smile. "Safe landing," he said, his voice calm and even. "I hope you had a good flight." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. What could she say? That she hadn't had a good flight at all? That she had spent the entire journey consumed by irrational fear and discomfort? That she had wanted nothing more than to escape from him, for reasons she couldn't even fully explain? But all she managed was a tight smile and a nod. "Yeah," she said, her voice hollow. "Safe landing." Michael nodded, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. He stood up, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment, and then stepped aside to let her out. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stood up, feeling the stiffness in her legs from sitting for so long. She reached for her bag, but her hands were shaking, and she almost dropped it. Michael noticed and quickly reached out to steady it for her. "Here, let me help," he offered, his voice kind. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she mumbled a quiet, "Thank you." She didn't know what else to say. How could she thank him when she had spent the entire flight wishing she didn't have to sit next to him? As they made their way off the plane, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. She had let her fears and prejudices control her, and now, as she walked beside the man who had been nothing but kind to her, she realized just how wrong she had been. But it was too late to take it back now. All she could do was try to learn from the experience and hope that in the future she could be better than the person she had been on this flight. The plane had landed safely, and the passengers were slowly disembarking, but Sarah's mind was still reeling from the emotions that had overwhelmed her during the flight. The airport terminal was a flurry of activity, with people rushing to their connecting flights, retrieving their luggage, or simply trying to find their way out. Sarah walked in a daze, her bag clutched tightly in her hand, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. She couldn't stop thinking about Michael, the man who had sat next to her on the plane. He had been nothing but kind and calm throughout the entire flight, while she had been a bundle of nerves, consumed by irrational fears and prejudices. She felt a deep sense of shame, but also a strange kind of relief. The flight was over, and she could finally put the experience behind her, or so she thought. As she made her way toward the baggage claim, she noticed Michael walking a few paces ahead of her. He was easy to spot, his tall frame and confident stride making him stand out in the crowd. For a moment, she considered changing her route, avoiding him entirely, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the guilt that still gnawed at her, or maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, she felt a strange connection to him, one that she didn't fully understand. She decided to keep her distance, trailing a few steps behind him as they approached the baggage carousel. The hum of the conveyor belt and the clatter of luggage filled the air as passengers gathered around, waiting for their bags to appear. Sarah stood off to the side, watching as Michael calmly waited for his suitcase. She didn't know why she was watching him, why she felt this compulsion to stay close, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away. There was something about him that drew her in, something that made her want to understand him better. As the bags began to appear on the carousel, Sarah saw her own suitcase coming around. She stepped forward to grab it, but in her haste, she misjudged the timing, and the bag slipped from her grasp, tumbling off the carousel and onto the floor. Embarrassed, she bent down to pick it up, but before she could reach it, Michael was there, effortlessly lifting the suitcase and handing it to her with a smile. "Here you go," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. Sarah took the bag from him, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Thank you," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "No problem," he replied, his tone warm and friendly. "I hope your trip wasn't too stressful." There was no judgment in his voice, no hint that he had noticed her discomfort on the plane. If anything, he seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, and that only made Sarah feel worse. She had treated him with suspicion and discomfort, while he had treated her with nothing but kindness. For a moment, she considered apologizing, trying to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? So instead, she simply nodded and gave him a weak smile. Michael returned the smile and then turned to grab his own suitcase from the carousel. Sarah watched him for a moment longer, feeling a strange mix of emotions, guilt, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She turned to leave, intending to head for the exit and put this entire experience behind her, but before she could take a step, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. It was like a vice tightening around her heart, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The pain was intense, radiating out from her chest and down her left arm. Sarah gasped, clutching at her chest as she staggered backward, her vision blurring. She tried to cry out for help, but the words caught in her throat, choked off by the pain. The world around her began to spin, the sounds of the airport fading into a distant hum. She felt herself falling, but she couldn't stop it, couldn't do anything but succumb to the overwhelming pain that consumed her. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was Michael, his eyes widening in alarm as he rushed toward her, his voice calling out for help. When Sarah regained consciousness, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the airport terminal, surrounded by concerned faces. The pain in her chest had subsided to a dull ache, but she still felt weak and disoriented. She blinked, trying to make sense of what had happened, and then she saw him, Michael, kneeling beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. "Help is on the way." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, and all she could manage was a faint nod. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, growing louder as they approached. The crowd around her parted as paramedics arrived, quickly assessing the situation and preparing to move her onto a stretcher. Michael stepped back to give them room, but he didn't leave her side. He stayed close, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos that surrounded her. As the paramedics worked, Sarah's mind drifted, her thoughts muddled by the lingering pain and the overwhelming sense of fear. How had this happened? One moment, she had been fine, and the next, her body had betrayed her, sending her spiraling into a terrifying, life-threatening situation. And through it all, Michael had been there, calm, composed, and ready to help, just as he had been during the flight. The paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, strapping her in and preparing to transport her to the ambulance. As they wheeled her away, she caught one last glimpse of Michael, standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression one of deep concern. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Sarah felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite define. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more, a connection that transcended the brief, awkward encounter they had shared on the plane. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was look at him, hoping he could see the gratitude in her eyes, the unspoken apology for the way she had treated him. The ambulance doors closed, cutting off her view of the terminal, and Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the fatigue that had settled deep in her bones. As the ambulance sped away, sirens blaring, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to Michael, the man who had been a stranger only hours ago, but who had now become something much more. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Sarah heard when she woke up. The steady electronic sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was still alive. She blinked, trying to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Her body felt heavy, and there was a dull ache in her chest, but the sharp, terrifying pain was gone. As her vision cleared, Sarah took in her surroundings. She was in a hospital room, the walls a sterile white, the air tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic. An IV was hooked up to her arm, and a nasal cannula provided her with a steady flow of oxygen. She was alone, save for the machines that monitored her vital signs. Memories of the airport rushed back, collapsing at the baggage claim, the pain in her chest, Michael's voice calling out for help. Michael. The thought of him brought a surge of emotions, gratitude, shame, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. She didn't have much time to dwell on it, though, as the door to her room swung open and a nurse walked in. The nurse smiled warmly when she saw that Sarah was awake. "Good to see you're up," the nurse said, checking the monitors and making notes on a clipboard. "How are you feeling?" Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. "Better, I think," she croaked. "What happened?" The nurse looked at her sympathetically. "You had a heart attack, but you're stable now. The doctors took care of you right away. You're lucky you got help so quickly." A heart attack. The words sent a shiver of fear through Sarah. She was only 32. How could she have had a heart attack? She tried to process the information, but it felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. The nurse must have seen the confusion on her face, because she reached out and patted Sarah's hand gently. "It can be a lot to take in, but you're in good hands. The doctors will be in soon to talk to you about your recovery." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind still reeling. The nurse finished her checks and left the room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once more. She stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. A heart attack. It seemed impossible, yet here she was, lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that were keeping her alive. And then there was Michael. The image of him kneeling beside her in the airport, his face etched with concern, flashed through her mind. He had been there for her, when she needed help the most, She owed him her life. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and a moment later, the door opened again. This time it wasn't a nurse who walked in, but Michael himself. He was dressed in the same clothes he had worn on the plane, looking a little tired but still composed. He hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether he should enter. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, not from fear or discomfort, but from the sheer surprise of seeing him. She hadn't expected him to come. What was he doing here? "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the room, a small smile on his lips. "Hey," he said softly, "I just wanted to check on you, see how you were doing." Sarah's chest tightened, not with pain but with emotion. She didn't know what to say. How could she thank him for what he had done? How could she apologize for the way she had treated him? I'm okay, I think," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "They said it was a heart attack." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, that's what they told me. I'm glad you're okay. You had me worried there for a minute." His words were so sincere, so full of genuine concern, that Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She blinked back tears, feeling more vulnerable than she ever had in her life. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my life, and I treated you so badly. I'm so sorry, Michael." Michael shook his head, stepping closer to the bed. "You don't need to apologize, Sarah. I'm just glad I could help. That's what matters." But Sarah couldn't let it go. The guilt had been gnawing at her since the plane, and now, faced with the man who had saved her life, she couldn't hold back any longer. "No, it's not okay," she insisted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was so awful to you just because of my own stupid prejudices. I was afraid of you for no reason, and you were nothing but kind to me. I'm so ashamed." Michael looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and pulled up a chair beside her bed, sitting down with a weary grace. "Sarah," he said gently, "we all have our own baggage, our own fears and biases. What matters is what we do when we're faced with them. You're here, alive, and you're reflecting on it. That's more than a lot of people would do." Sarah wiped at her tears, her heart aching with the weight of his words. She had spent so much of her life building walls, keeping people at a distance, convinced that she didn't need anyone. But now, those walls had crumbled, and all that was left was the raw, unfiltered truth. "I don't deserve your kindness," she whispered, feeling the full weight of her confession. Michael leaned forward, his eyes soft and kind. "You don't have to deserve it. Kindness isn't something you earn. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do." His words were like a balm for her soul, soothing the wounds she had carried for so long. In that moment, Sarah realized that she had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at being a better person. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't waste this opportunity. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet resolve. "Thank you for saving my life and for helping me see what I couldn't before." Michael smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You're welcome, Sarah. I'm just glad you're okay." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the tension between them finally dissipating. Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The door to the room opened again, and this time, a doctor walked in, clipboard in hand. He smiled when he saw that Sarah was awake. "Good to see you're up," the doctor said, glancing at Michael and nodding in greeting. "We've run some tests, and I'd like to go over the results with you." Michael stood up, understanding that it was time for him to go. He turned to Sarah, his expression gentle. "I'll let you talk to the doctor. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Sarah nodded, feeling a pang of sadness as he prepared to leave. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." He gave her one last smile before turning and walking out of the room, leaving her alone with the doctor. As the door closed behind him, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Michael's actions, but for the lesson he had taught her. The doctor began to explain the test results, but Sarah's mind was only half focused on his words. She was thinking about Michael, about the way he had treated her with such kindness and compassion, even after everything she had done. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Weeks had passed since Sarah's heart attack, and life had slowly begun to return to a semblance of normalcy. After being discharged from the hospital, she took time off from work to recover, both physically and mentally. The doctors had told her she needed to make significant lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, stress management, to prevent another heart attack, and she was determined to follow their advice. But it wasn't just her physical health that she needed to address. The experience had shaken her to the core, forcing her to confront the biases and fears she had buried deep within herself. She couldn't ignore the fact that her actions on that plane had been driven by prejudice, an ugly truth that she had to face. During her recovery, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael often. She couldn't forget the way he had stepped in to save her life, how he had shown her kindness despite the way she had treated him. She wanted to make things right, to reach out to him and express her gratitude in a more meaningful way. But she wasn't sure how to do it, or if he would even want to hear from her again. One afternoon, as she sat in her living room with a cup of tea, Sarah finally decided to take action. She pulled out her laptop and began searching online, hoping to find some way to contact Michael. It took a bit of digging, but eventually she found his LinkedIn profile. From there, she discovered that he worked as a community organizer, focusing on social justice initiatives in underserved neighborhoods. The more she learned about him, the more impressed she became. Michael wasn't just a good person, he was actively working to make the world a better place. Sarah felt a pang of regret as she thought about how her initial impressions of him had been so wrong, so unfair. With a deep breath, she composed a message, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, "Dear Michael, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out and thank you again for everything you did for me. You saved my life, and I can't express how grateful I am for your kindness and quick thinking. I also want to apologize for how I treated you on the plane. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for the way I acted. This experience has made me realize how much I need to change, and I'm committed to becoming a better person. I've been reading about the work you do, and I'm truly inspired. If there's any way I can support your efforts or get involved, please let me know. I'd like to contribute in any way I can. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. Sincerely, Sarah Thompson." She hesitated for a moment before hitting send. But then she did it, sending the message out into the digital ether, unsure of what would happen next. A sense of relief washed over her, knowing that she had taken the first step toward making amends. The days that followed were filled with anticipation. Sarah checked her email and LinkedIn regularly, hoping for a response, but none came. She tried not to let it bother her, telling herself that Michael was probably busy with his work. But as more time passed, the doubts began to creep in. Had she said too much? Not enough? Was he angry with her? Or had he simply moved on? Just as she was beginning to lose hope, an email notification pinged on her phone. It was from Michael. Her heart raced as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words, "Hi Sarah, thank you for your message. I'm glad to hear that you're doing well and that you're taking steps to recover and grow from this experience. I appreciate your apology, but there's no need to dwell on the past. What matters is what we do moving forward. As for getting involved, I'd be happy to discuss some opportunities with you. We're always looking for volunteers and supporters who are passionate about making a difference. Let's set up a time to talk. I think you'll find that there's a lot you can contribute. Take care, Michael Carter." Sarah felt a wave of emotion as she read his words. He had forgiven her, and he was offering her a chance to be part of something bigger, something meaningful. It was more than she had hoped for, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose as she typed out her reply, setting up a time to meet with him. When the day of their meeting arrived, Sarah was both nervous and excited. She hadn't seen Michael since the hospital, and she wasn't sure how things would go. But as she walked into the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, her anxiety melted away when she saw him sitting at a table, smiling as he waved her over. "Sarah," he greeted her warmly as she sat down. "It's good to see you." "You too," she replied, genuinely meaning it. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They spent the next hour talking about the work Michael was doing in the community, organizing food drives, advocating for affordable housing, mentoring at-risk youth. The more he talked, the more Sarah realized how much she wanted to be a part of this work. She had spent so much of her life focused on her career, on achieving success, that she had lost sight of what really mattered. Now she wanted to make a difference. By the end of their meeting, Sarah had committed to volunteering at one of Michael's upcoming events. They parted ways with a promise to stay in touch, and as Sarah walked back to her car, she felt lighter than she had in years. She was finally on a path that felt right, one that was about more than just herself. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into her new role as a volunteer. She helped organize events, raise funds, and connect with community members. The work was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. She found herself growing closer to Michael, not just as a colleague, but as a friend. They shared long conversations about life, about the struggles they had both faced, and about the changes they wanted to see in the world. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was part of something important, something that truly mattered. And in the process, she was becoming a better person, more open, more compassionate, more willing to confront her own flaws. One evening, after a particularly successful event, Sarah and Michael found themselves alone, cleaning up the last of the decorations. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the room. Sarah looked over at Michael, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything he had done for her, not just saving her life, but helping her find her purpose. "Michael," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I just want you to know how much this means to me. You've helped me see the world in a completely different way, and I'll always be grateful for that." Michael paused, turning to face her. His expression was thoughtful, his eyes warm and kind. "You did that yourself, Sarah. I just gave you a little nudge. The rest was all you." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice full of sincerity. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Sarah realized then that her life had taken a turn she hadn't expected, but it was exactly where she needed to be. She had found a new path, a new purpose, and a new friend in Michael, a man she had once feared but who had now become one of the most important people in her life. As they finished cleaning up and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever it was, she was ready for it. She had faced her fears, confronted her prejudices, and come out stronger on the other side. And as she walked out of the building with Michael by her side, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that she was excited to write. The months that followed were transformative for Sarah. The once single-minded corporate lawyer found herself deeply embedded in the community, working alongside Michael and others who shared a passion for social justice and making a real difference. The work was challenging, sometimes frustrating, but always rewarding. For the first time, Sarah felt like she was living a life that mattered. Sarah's involvement grew beyond simple volunteer work. She began using her legal skills to help the community, offering pro bono legal services to those who couldn't afford representation. She helped people fight unfair evictions, navigate the complex legal system, and secure the rights they were entitled to. The more she gave, the more she realized how much she had to offer and how much fulfillment she found in this new purpose. But it wasn't just about the work. It was about the relationships she was building, the connections with people she might never have met if her life had continued on its previous path. People like Michael, who had become more than just a friend. He was a mentor, a confidant, and someone who challenged her to be the best version of herself. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat on a park bench after a long day of work, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The leaves around them were turning shades of gold and red, and the air was cool and refreshing. She turned to Michael, who was watching the children play in the distance, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Michael," she began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about how far I've come since that day on the plane. I never imagined my life would change so much, but I'm grateful that it did." Michael smiled, his gaze shifting from the children to her. You've come a long way, Sarah. It's been incredible to watch you grow and see how much you've given back to the community. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just from his words, but from the truth in them. She had changed, and it was a change she was proud of. But there was something more she needed to say, something that had been on her mind for a while. "I've been meaning to tell you," she continued, her eyes meeting his, "that you've inspired me in so many ways. You showed me what it means to truly care about others, to put yourself out there for something bigger than yourself. I don't think I would have found this path without you." Michael looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft. "Sarah, you had that strength in you all along. You just needed a push to realize it. I'm glad I could be part of your journey." His words, simple as they were, resonated deeply with Sarah. She realized that what she felt for Michael went beyond gratitude or friendship. There was something deeper, something she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. She hesitated, unsure whether to voice the feelings that had been building inside her. But before she could say anything, Michael spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. "Sarah, I want you to know that I've always admired your courage. It takes a lot to confront your own biases and change the direction of your life so completely, and you've done it with such grace." The sincerity in his voice touched her, and Sarah felt a swell of emotion. She knew then that she couldn't keep her feelings to herself any longer. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've come to realize that you mean more to me than just a friend or a mentor. I don't know where this is going or what it means exactly, but I care about you. A lot." The confession hung in the air between them, the silence that followed filled with anticipation. Sarah's heart raced as she waited for his response, unsure of what he would say. Michael's expression softened, and a slow smile spread across his face. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I care about you too, more than I can put into words. I didn't want to push you because I knew you were going through so much, but I've felt the same way for a while now." Relief and joy flooded Sarah's heart as she squeezed his hand, a smile breaking across her face. The connection they had built over the past few months had grown into something more, something deeper than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't just about the work they were doing together, but about the bond they had formed, a bond that had started in the most unexpected of places. They sat there for a moment, hand in hand, letting the reality of their feelings settle in. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of peace and excitement for what was to come. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park, Sarah leaned her head on Michael's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of contentment. This was where she was meant to be, beside someone who understood her, who challenged her, and who cared for her as deeply as she cared for him. They didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Together, they would continue the work they had started, making a difference in the lives of others while building a life of their own. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful, something she had never expected, but had found in the most unexpected of places. Sarah's journey was one of transformation, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. What began as a life-threatening event had turned into an opportunity for growth, connection, and love. Through her experiences, she had learned the importance of confronting her fears, challenging her prejudices, and opening her heart to new possibilities. She had found a new purpose, a new path, and in Michael, she had found a partner who shared her values and her vision for a better world. Together, they would continue to make a difference, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of those around them. The story of Sarah and Michael is a reminder that life can change in an instant, but it's how we respond to those changes that define who we are. It's a story of redemption, of finding love in the most unexpected places, and of the power of kindness and compassion to transform lives. As Sarah looked to the future, she knew that there would be challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them with courage and with Michael by her side. Their journey was just beginning, and it was one they would walk together hand in hand, building a life filled with purpose, love, and hope.